Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Adventures of the mind today, from the way we think about ageing to campaigns for liberty, life on the road and art on the grandest scale you can imagine. Paul Theroux, one of the world's best-loved travel writers, has produced a kind of anthology or chapbook of travel writing called The Tao of Travel. 50 years after the birth of Amnesty International, its new 50-year-old General Secretary, Salil Shetty, is with us to celebrate and reminisce. Later, Catherine Mayer of Time magazine explains her new view about how we age or try not to age, what she calls amortality. But we're starting today with one of the most ambitious and I think radical artists of our time, a man who works not in paint, bronze or even video, but in earth and clay, making what Charles Jencks calls landforms. Charles Jencks, I'm trying to find a way of visualising for people the work that you do, and perhaps one way of doing that would be to talk about the work that's being created right at the moment in Northumberland. So perhaps you could just start by describing that.
Well, a lot of my work comes from coal sites, cleaning up the environment from disturbance. And in this case, it's about a quarter of a mile long landform, which I was asked to design by Matt Ridley and Banks, a coal company, and they wanted something that would be a gateway to the north. So I was explicitly asked to do an icon, and I thought for a long time, well, what is worthy of, what's on our mind most of the time, not necessarily sex, but the body, the face, and our interaction with people. We have more neurons to do with facial recognition than you can believe than any other point of recognition. And so I worked very hard designing a landform in the shape of a reclining woman, twisted in a kind of serpentina, a dancing figure. After I'd done it, I realized that such a figure was drawn in the caves of Lascaux, the same sort of zigzag figure, showing how old that image is, really, and how iconic. We immediately
This woman will be vast. I mean, she will be the size of some of those great cut horses in the south of England, or even longer.
She'll be even much bigger. I think she's by 3 times the largest human figure on this planet. I think, of course, it's very hard to prove, but the next biggest is being constructed in stone, I think, in Wyoming, near the presidents, the 4 presidents who were sculpted. That's 50 feet high, and her face, Northumberlandia's face, is 150 feet long.
Wow.
So it makes, parts of her body so big that you don't recognize where you are on her. You recognize her nose. If you fell off her nose, it would be a really dangerous 20-foot drop. And that's one of the interesting problems, to map the human body, the face, to the landscape. And I didn't want anything that was too recognizable all the time. I mean, what could be more boring than being confronted by the Colossus of Tony Blair? It would drive you crazy. So I have to design something that comes in and out of focus.
That's wonderful. And some of your other works, the sort of serpentine, terraced, sculpted, cut, carved landscapes with clear shapes in them which refer to, a lot of the time in recent years, scientific ideas.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the big idea, of course, with the decline of religion and meta-narratives explaining what's going on to us, I think the universe or the cosmos has taken over that role. And so I work with scientists, although I criticize some of their metaphors, like the Big Bang. It wasn't big, wasn't a bang, no one heard it. It was a fast expansion of space. I use these metaphors, black hole, another one, and I criticize them and then design visual metaphors of value, as Gombrich used to say. Something that is striking, original, and related to our bodies once again.
You are trying to make art quite seriously about the most profound and often most difficult ideas that we're struggling with now. This is art which sometimes may look like a garden, but is cerebral.
Well, during the invasion of Iraq, I was asked to design a garden in France for around the notion of chaos, and so I naturally took war as one of the most chaotic institutions of the human, and had created a water pult where water is thrown back and forth, and used it to signify the Israeli-Palestinian tit for tat. So a water war garden became the metaphor for chaos, and that was 2003 and 4, just at the time Iraq was being attacked with this pseudo war on terror.
I could think of other examples of gardening about war. One of the most famous Scottish artists would be Ian Hamilton Finlay, who created a great garden. And he said something that you quoted in your book about gardens not being a retreat, but a form of attack.
He said famously, a garden is not just a retreat from the world, but an attack. And his work was meant and was critical of the contemporary democratic situation, its democratic deficit, and some of the problems of the hypocrisy of political correctness. So he was a key figure.
Before we open this up, just let me ask a little bit about the economics of the art you do, because a great deal of modern art is about producing an easily saleable, instantly recognisable image or series of images for an artist. So whether it's Damien Hirst or whoever it is, will produce something that is instantly and recognisably a Damien Hirst, which has a high value, is sold off to collectors and realises a quick income. It seems to me that your art is at the other end of that. You can't move it around, you can't pick it up and sell it to people, and it must cost a great deal to actually create in the first place.
Actually, it's quite the reverse on its cost at the beginning. That's how I got into it, because I was thinking, my late wife, Maggie, and I were thinking of buying a David Hockney, and I realized that you could create a sculptural landform at something like a 20th of the cost, and no one could steal it either. So actually, landforming is an inexpensive way of creating something that has a great history going right back to Stonehenge and before. The American Indians practiced it. In a way, I like to use nature to comment on the underlying laws of nature. So in the recent one outside of Edinburgh, it's designed around cells of life and looking at how your body cells duplicate through mitosis. That becomes the basic content.
Salil Shetty.
The thing that struck me just reading some of the background stuff on what you've been doing is the relationship between small and large and the sort of scale question, because this is a big issue managerially speaking as well. When you're running an organization, how large do you need to be in order to be effective? And I was just curious about how you look at the relationship between scaling up and in the context of what you do.
Although I've been asked to do these huge schemes because of coal sites, I'm very interested in the very small, and so I do what I call metaphysical landscapes, which are just small growing and rock sculptures, which so I'm not particularly committed to the extra large, but in our culture, of course, that's where the culture is going, and we are able to destroy and create so much so quickly today.
Catherine Mayer.
You talked about the growing role of science in society and the way that it's coming in to sort of fill gaps that are left by the way in which some of the other authorities, if you like, have receded. I'm interested by that. I mean, I'm sure that that's right, that we pay far more attention to scientists than we used to. But scientists are also fallible. And confused and argumentative. So I wondered to what extent that is also something that you try and explore in your work.
Well, I found scientists wonderful to work with and often work for nothing, which is great. I'm working with CERN now. But they are argumentative, and they are, I think, victims often of metaphors which are third-hand, such as the selfish gene, to mention another one. So in my work, it's always double design. You have to work with science and understand the underlying facts of the case, but you don't have to accept their really retrogressive metaphors like Big Bang, which is basically a Bush, Joint Chiefs of Staff metaphor.
Paul Theroux.
Yeah, I don't understand this garden is not a retreat but an attack. I think I made 3 or 4 gardens myself, and they are a retreat. I find them places to go, lovely places to sit, places to create, time is a factor in gardens. I noticed in your book that they seem static. They seem you scoop out a landscape and it's there. It turns green. I understand that, but it seems that it's made by a person. It's Charles Jencks' garden. If you take a Zen garden, it's a void. It's not made by anyone. It seems to have arrived. It's a place where there's appears to be nothing. You alluded to the American Indians. The Serpent Mound in Locust Grove is. I'm part Native American, so it means a lot to me. And I don't know whether there's a question in there, but I'm kind of reacting against what you've done.
Well, I did the Time Garden in Milan. I'm still working on it. It's 9 years of work. I would say, on the contrary, I'm absolutely immersed in time and the design of others. I collaborate all the time with others. So I don't accept that it's got my signature all over it. Of course, my own work has its identity and language and style. No question.
But I was also struck by one other thing in your book is that how ugly cities are compared with your garden. Your garden's in places very serene, harmonious, sculptural, and then everything surrounding it is looks so disgusting. Clutter, yeah, hideous buildings around them.
Well, again,
do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes, by contrast. I think that's true. Our lives are full of clutter, necessarily so, and a garden is a retreat in that sense.
It's also a form of art that you need to walk on and through to understand, which interests me, because, a lot of us have been educated to think that art is something sort of flat on a wall, or at least something sitting in a room that you walk around if it's a sculpture. But this is something you can't understand unless you walk through it. You have to physically engage them.
Absolutely. And I think the American Indians knew that. And the Nazca Indians...
they danced those lines, didn't they?
They walked the lines. And I think ancient Brits did the same. They walked the horses. Yeah.
Well, that leads us neatly to walking in another sense, and Paul Theroux's book, The Tao of Travel. This is a whole collection of different forms of narrative and mini essays, aphorisms and so on about the notion of travelling, Paul Theroux, and therefore it's difficult to sum up because for every statement about travel one's able to find an alternative in this book, pretty much. But can I just start with some of your own principles? For instance, that travel should mostly and essentially be a solitary act.
I think of it most usefully as a solitary act, but a vacation seems to me something that people do in groups, husband and wife, partners, lovers, friends, go on a trip together. But it's not travel in the old sense of revealing something about the trip. It's not about discovery. That the discovery or self-discovery usually comes in solitude. The solitary walker. Or the person travelling alone, the Crusoe figure, let's say. I always wonder, did Bruce Chatwin go alone? Did, I don't know, did Dr. Johnson go alone? We know the answer to that question. But did John Steinbeck go alone? He travels with Charlie, went with his dog. Turns out that in one of the sections of the book, I describe how a lot of people who appear to go alone, because this is kind of your question, the solitude of travel is an ideal, didn't go alone. So that they recognize the ideal of I'm alone against the elements, just me and my dog Charlie. But in fact, he had conjugal visits with his wife. And it's recently been revealed that even a lot of the book was invented, and that he was sick of the trip and made it up. But ideally, it's alone.
Is it possible to travel anymore in the way that you describe it? Not so long ago, it would have been a kind of romantic and exciting form of travel to walk the Inca Trail or to walk around Peru. These days, vast numbers of people are coming off jets and buses and queuing up to do these things. So much of the world, which was once a place where you could discover something new, you could discover something else about yourself, you could be alone, is simply another queue.
That's true, and people say that. You've just said it, but it's not. But actually, in 1853, Richard Burton went to Mecca in disguise, and in 1908, a man called A.J.B. Wavell did the same thing in disguise. No one's done it since then. You want a trip? Go to Mecca in disguise. Risk that, or for your gap year, or if you send your kids to Mecca in disguise. Tell them to learn Arabic.
Parents, turn off the wireless right now.
Get circumcised, learn Arabic, and do that. Try that, for example. A lot of people, what you're alluding to is lots of people go to Bangkok, lots of people go to Brazil. But not many people go to Afghanistan these days. If you go to Afghanistan or wander over the border of Iran, you'll probably be arrested. It doesn't make. I mean, there's more of a challenge in some countries these days than it was in the past. It's harder to cross through Africa now than it was in the time of Stanley. That Tim Butcher, quite a respected journalist, tried to go from Zanzibar to the mouth of the Congo a few years ago. He didn't fail. He made it, but he needed a lot of help. As countries open up, as you can go to Albania now, you can go to Russia. Others close. And Mr. Shetty will have something to say about that. But there are many countries that are very dangerous to travel in or forbidden to travel in. And so yes, it is still possible to travel. You just have to look at the world, not through a Google map, but, take a leap.
People travel for all sorts of reasons. I mean, they travel to run away from things. They travel to run towards things. What in your life has been the purpose of the great journeys you've done?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. When I was a little kid, my mother, I come from a family of 7 children. My mother used to say, play outside, go outside, please play outside, please go outdoors, I'm busy, go out. So the house this is in Massachusetts, so just playing outside was the beginning. And then I suppose just the idea of being alone, being solitary. If you come from a large family, you want the solitude of travel. That may come from that. But it's also due to the fact that the profession I chose for myself keeps me in a chair for years on end, writing novels, and it's escape from that.
Catherine Mayer.
You say solitude and getting away, but you also mentioned self-discovery.
Of course, yes.
And there is this sort of interesting balance between the idea of a journey as something being about self-discovery and being about discovery and observation. And I just wondered if real travel could ever be about actually avoiding both self-discovery and discovery rather than finding it. You mention in your book that Freud's fear of journeys, the Reiseangst, and so there is also the question about the journey itself as a metaphor for life and the inescapable destination of death. But there are many other things that people may wish to avoid, to escape, to distract.
In my book, I sort of answer that because I've been trying to account for... we're talking generally about travel, and my book is both about travel and travel books. There are books about... There's some sort of travel is falling in love. Some of it's self-discovery. Some of it is anthropology. Some of it is confrontation. Some of it is botany. Some of it might be wandering over Charles Jencks' beautiful landscapes. Some of it might be, looking for a landscape, looking for a metaphor. There's so many motives. So people think that a travel book is one thing. It's many things. It's many things. But some of it is pure autobiography. It's the clearest expression of autobiography of the self that you can find. Although it's happening in Brazil or it's happening in Argentina or something.
Some of it is collecting new smells. Charles Jencks, I think.
I was fascinated, if that's not too strong a word, by the discussion of the navel of the world, and it reminded me of something which may be true. I heard when I was young that every tribe in the past, and maybe today, carries a center of the earth pole around with them when they travel, when they walk, if they're nomads. And wherever they put the pole is the center of the earth. And what I find fascinating by that from a scientific point of view is that although Copernicus, the famous Copernican revolution, distanced us from the center of the universe, in fact, it's true. Wherever you stick a pole, it is the center of the earth because the earth comes from that infinitely dense point, and therefore every part of the universe is at the center in some metaphorical sense. I wonder if you came across these center of the earth poles and whether you have one.
No, I don't. But what you find is not so much the center of the earth pole, but there's a center of the earth mentality. Most cultures, virtually whole cultures, think that if they don't have a pole, they are the center. And Native American people are an example. The Ojibwe people, the Chippewa, that name means the original people. Inuit means original people. I live in Hawaii half the year. Kanaka Maoli means the original people. We're people. If you go to, what you find in travel is that when you go to a place, you're meeting people who regard you as not a person. You might be a distant ancestor, but you're not a person in the same sense that they are. I am a person, you're a stranger. You're Charles, you're a guy from some other place, but I'm a person in my country. And that gives you the center of the earth. This egocentric way of looking at the world is very, very common. I mean, in fact, you find that that one of the difficulties of travel is that you're meeting people who don't regard you as human, not as human as they are anyway.
This business of the centre of the world being wherever you want it to be reminds me of Colonel Gaddafi. When I went to visit Colonel Gaddafi with Blair, and we asked where he was, and they said, he's at the place. And we said, where is the place? And they said, he's at the place. Which place? And the place was simply wherever Colonel Gaddafi happened to be was the centre of the country and the place to which everybody would go, which takes us neatly on to dictators, I guess. And it is 50 years since Amnesty International was founded. Salil Shetty is the new General Secretary, also 50, I think, Salil. So that makes...
The whole world knows my age now.
It was founded really through a single letter to one newspaper about one tiny little protest 50 years ago.
Absolutely. I think it's all about ordinary people getting together to do extraordinary things. In fact, Peter Benenson went into St. Martin in the Fields, a church, when he heard the story about two young Portuguese students who had been arrested during the Salazar regime in Portugal just for raising a toast to freedom. And from there came the amnesty idea, and within weeks, thousands of people started forming local groups, and today we have more than 3 million people fighting against dictatorship and all sorts of freedoms.
And Amnesty's iconic image of the candle with the barbed wire spiral around it came right from the beginning too.
Absolutely. I mean, that's how it started, and since then, more than 40,000 political prisoners have been freed, and freed by people's action. And there couldn't be a more appropriate time to talk about this, because in the last 6 months we've seen what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa. Once again, people coming together, standing up for their rights, and it's starting to happen in Madrid in the recent past as well. So.
The story of Amnesty includes some extraordinary individual cases, because, as you said, it starts with people sitting at home, not travelling, but they're sitting at their desks and they're writing letters and firing them off. This is long before emails and texts and all the rest of it. And the notion, it seems a naive idea that individuals in countries, to start with in the West, could actually have any impact at all on repressive dictatorships or authoritarian regimes anywhere else by simply writing letters.
Well, it seems to have worked. I mean, it was called one of the larger insanities of the time when it was founded. But, since then we've had about 40,000 political prisoners released. If you take the one major campaign we ran on death penalty, when we started fighting for the abolition of death penalty, there were only 16 countries who were ready to abolish it. We now have 96 countries. So, it's and the whole Convention Against Torture. I mean, torture seemed to be an accepted way of behavior, but that was completely challenged over the years.
It's also unusual in being as far removed from an ideological organisation as it's possible to imagine. You don't take positions to the left or to the right or anything else. It's simply about freeing prisoners of conscience around the world. That's led you to some difficult internal debates, hasn't it? I'm thinking of the famous argument about Nelson Mandela and the armed struggle in South Africa, and did that make Nelson Mandela a suitable person for Amnesty to rally behind, which today seems a strange question, but was very intense at the time.
I think it's very important for Amnesty to retain that independence and objectivity, and most of our work is based on quite a lot of detailed research. I mean, this is a bit of a challenge for us today, because if you have YouTube and WikiLeaks and all of these things happening in 1 hour cycles and 2 hour cycles, our research normally takes 2 to 3 years. And so that is a big challenge. But I mean, on the question of not supporting anybody who espouses violence, that was the issue in the case of Mandela. I mean, yes, with hindsight, it's different. But we did support a lot of other, what we call prisoners of conscience. But in the case of Mandela, that was a hot debate internally.
And you didn't at the time, did you?
No, we didn't, of course. But I mean, we did support the anti-apartheid struggle. But in the individual case was an issue.
Coming right up to date before we open this out, you mentioned WikiLeaks just now. Very interesting. Now you're confronting problems where freedom of information spilling out into the public domain, can actually cause serious threat to individuals. So the sort of naive notion that freedom of information and freedom of conscience always go together is wrong. And in fact, you're arguing with WikiLeaks, I think, about this at the moment, aren't you?
I mean, we had an initial argument around Afghanistan that, there shouldn't be individuals' names of people who are giving out the sources. That puts them at risk. But they did take them out, and the later releases, I think they've taken care of that. But
they in fact allowed Amnesty International people to come in and redact names and help them with that.
We had a sort of heated discussion, and then much water has flowed since then. But I mean, on the balance between public interest and national security, I think we would definitely lean towards freedom of information and public accountability. That's really where we're coming from.
Paul Theroux.
This is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Shetty, because I've been a member of Amnesty for a very, very long time, since I was in Africa. I went to Africa in the 60s as a teacher, and I stayed there for 6 years, and we were always in the presence of political prisoners. And as a matter of fact, in terms of travel, most people travel or have vacations in dictatorships. It happens to be a fact that when people want to go have a good time, they go to a place like Kenya, where there are political prisoners, or to look at animals in Zimbabwe, there are political prisoners, or in the past in South Africa, where there was political prisoners, racism, but they were seeing elephants, so what the hell. But I wanted to ask you a question about a man called Agostinho Neto, who was a political prisoner in Angola, put in prison by the Portuguese. This would have been in the 60s. And there was a campaign, Amnesty had a campaign for Agostinho Neto, who was a poet. Then later he became the Prime Minister or perhaps President of Angola, and he became someone who put political prisoners, who was responsible for. He had been released by Amnesty, and then he became a persecutor. Does this happen very often?
Yeah, I think when people get to seats of power. I mean, as they say, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So,
but also he's an ungrateful little horrible person. I mean, what is the story with that?
No, but I mean that's precisely why our campaigns have evolved quite a lot. We are now also looking at. I mean, if you take the International Criminal Court. Which now brings these people to account at the international level. That was a major campaign we ran. So we evolved quite a lot from the individual prisoner to having norms and standards and infrastructure at the global level for accountability.
Some people worry that you've expanded too far, that you're running campaigns on issues of poverty and gender and so on, which may be very important, but are somehow less focused, less sharp than the old campaigns.
But the thing is, I think the important thing is that Amnesty has adapted by listening to people whose human rights are being violated, because it might be easy for us to sit here and make a judgment on what's right and what's wrong, but we have to be responsive to the needs of the people whose rights are being violated. So when we started, we would look at prisons, but dictators became more and more clever. They stopped putting people in prisons. They were just disappearing people. So we had to start looking at enforced disappearances. We used to deal only with individual rights till Rwanda happened. With a genocide like that, you couldn't take it. And then, of course, most of the prisoners we discovered also were men. So the whole issue of women's rights came in later on, and I can tell you very briefly, Indonesia, you take the case of Indonesia, I was there recently. 20 years ago, we were working mainly on the dictatorship there, the Suharto issue, etc. Today, a lot of the deaths are happening during childbirth. 20,000 women die every year during childbirth. So it's just keeping in with the reality of the time.
Charles Jencks.
Yes, I'm also very in favor of it, but I don't know who sets the agenda. What brain trust do you have behind you decides to go into these new areas and define? Because you have to do it preemptively. Obviously, you need all the information. You've got to research it. But someone is setting your agenda, and who is that? How is that agenda set?
No, in fact, that's what makes Amnesty International quite unique, because we are a membership organization. So Paul is a member, and hope that by the time we finish, you'll all have become members of Amnesty International if you aren't already members. And it's not just membership in terms of making
But
contribution.
3 million people can't set an agenda.
No, but that's what I was saying, that, not all the 3 million are active on a day-to-day basis, but a significant chunk are, so we have elected boards of governance. So our board is elected. So it could be a musician, a plumber. It's not just human rights, legal experts. And apart from the governance, which is internal, we spend a lot of time talking to the people whose rights are being violated, and they are the ones who ultimately have to help us design the agenda. But it's not an easy choice to make.
I joined because I'm against torture. It was purely the anti-torture. I've lived in countries where people were tortured. Amnesty is against torture, and the United States has allowed torture, so it was purely that. But torture is something that some people agree on. And most people agree you shouldn't have political prisoners, but there are some people who think, well, maybe torture's okay, you can find the truth. Well, that's why I joined.
Well, at any rate, we can agree that Amnesty is 50 and is debating its identity, as it always does. And actually, a lot of people debate their identity around the age of 50. And in the old days, we'd be slipping towards retirement at that age. But Catherine Mayer, in your new book, Immortality, the Pleasures and Perils of Living Agelessly, you point out that many people, certainly in the rich parts of the world, are now thinking about ageing in an entirely different way. So let's just start with the basics. Immortality, it's a word you've coined in Time magazine, is what?
It describes, I say living agelessly. What I'm actually talking about is the fact that not only do we not grow old as we used to, we don't grow up as we used to, we don't go through the ages and stages of life as we used to. You might think that because we're living longer, 30 years on average since the beginning of the 20th century, that we'd fit in more ages and stages, more than the 7 ages defined by Shakespeare. Instead, you find that it's very hard to tell what age somebody is from what they like to do, from how they dress, from even their physical condition, their cognitive condition. So there's this sort of illusion going on, and you see it at both ends of the spectrum. People tend to think it's more noticeable in older people, you can see it more easily, but they tend to think that it wouldn't affect younger people. It does. I mean, we worry about children becoming adopting adult behaviours, for example. This illusion happens right the way through.
At some point in the last half century, the ideal age, or the iconic age, changed. It seems to me that if you look at photographs or films of people in the 1950s and 1960s, very quickly, when people are about 16, they want to look about 30. And everybody's sort of, a proper grown-up person wearing a proper suit and a proper haircut, either genders. Whereas these days, the iconic age is a teenage image almost.
Well, one of the ironies is clearly immortality has been driven by baby boomers. It isn't by any means confined to baby boomers. But one of the things that a lot made me laugh when I was researching this book, and I am a baby boomer. I'm the same age as Amnesty. But what made me laugh was the way in which boomers became the great proponents of youth culture. They were part of this youth revolution, and they never envisaged that they'd grow up and grow old and become the people who were then disrespected by the youth culture that they'd created. But a lot of its enduring legacy, if you like, you see in the irony that as the population ages, and the whole population of the world is growing older all the time, that our veneration of youth is increasing rather than decreasing. We're not actually learning to appreciate, the older people who are in greater numbers around us.
How much of immortality is material selfishness and indeed very expensive lifestyle of a small number of people who can think they can hold back the years by technology?
Clearly that's one very obvious manifestation of immortality. We live in a very solipsistic society. We live in society that has lost sense of community. So that's part of both what drives immortality and one of its manifestations. But I have to say I take a much more positive view. You might say I would do because I tend to think I am immortal. But there's a nice quote in there from that famous philosopher Bob Geldof, who says that age disappears in direct proportion to the vitality of your ideas. And I think that that is also very important. You know, there are all of us around this table in a previous era would have been on our way to the scrap heap, if not already on the scrap heap. And actually, you know, to me, one of the things that is sad is our inability to see that people are capable of things at all different ages of life. You know,
it's a double thing, isn't it? Because clearly, at one level, if we're all living longer, then we have to work for longer as well. Otherwise, all of our economies will collapse and turn turtle. People have to find creative and busy things to do for much, much longer,
exactly.
Which means they have to stay healthy enough to do that.
Yes.
And that's a good thing. But there is an aspect of this which is simply terror of death, isn't it?
That I think that actually goes back to what I was asking Paul relating to journeys and distraction. Is I think that a great driver of a huge amount of human activity is fear of death and a desire to distract. But I think it also in our society goes further, that we have a dependence anxiety as well. So, for example, a lot of the debate around assisted dying is about this idea that, it would be so terrible to actually be dependent, and therefore you start trying to control your age and death by saying, okay, I'll
maximum
go
amount
to
of good
Switzerland.
living and quickest possible death, not connected to other people who then have to look after
Exactly.
you. That's what people want. Charles Jencks.
I was reminded in your phrase, live agelessly, of Nietzsche's famous remark, live dangerously. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering whether you're going to write a polemic like Nietzsche, in Nietzsche's style, maybe, proposing that we live agelessly. But the one obvious downside today is the way it's led, as you point out, the life of Hollywood to become a norm. And one thinks of the infantilization of our culture by celebrities, by Hollywood, by the monarchy, and so on and so forth. And I think the average mental age of our culture, if one can have a mental age of a global culture, is 14 and descending towards probably the limit of 8. And I wonder if you have anything to say about the infantilization drive.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there is clearly a danger that in not growing up as we used to, that we become infantilized, that we dumb down. That is not, you can't blame amortality for that, but it is part of the process that actually drives amortality. I mentioned our increasing faith in science. It seems to me that what's happened is that as the various authorities that we trusted, like the church, politicians, I mean, God, can you remember when we used to trust politicians? As those
clearly, no.
As those authorities lost power, we transferred our faith to scientists and to celebrities. I don't really feel that comfortable about trusting science. I feel even less so about trusting to celebrity. It's part of our culture, and as I say, it reinforces amortality.
Salil, Shetty.
Catherine, I when I started reading the bits of the book, and then I was thinking this is really about people who are really privileged, and this because so many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have life expectancies of 40 and 45, and you were talking about, and then I did the test at the end of the book, and I discovered I was amortal, and I said it can't be that bad. But the issue really, and I've had the same question earlier about privilege. How many people can travel, and so the issue of the relationship between poverty and human rights is very central to everything that we need to talk about, I think, because if you look at it, you said you are against torture, but who are the people who are being tortured? Who are the people who are in prisons? They're mostly poor people. I mean, I was just in Brazil recently. Brazil and Rio, 1,000 people are killed by the police every year. So-called security battles with drug dealers, and most of them are poor and black, and their mortality is, appalling. So
this book was not actually conceived as a polemic, but I said I laughed at a lot of the research. I also got furiously angry at one particular underlying factor, and that is the health gap and lifespan gap between the rich and the poor in rich countries. If you look at the life expectancy of a man in Blackpool and a man in Kensington, there is about a 10-year gap. If you look at the health span gap between them, it is 17 years.
Yes, I agree that with Mr. Shetty that in many countries you live and then you die, and people don't think about Botox or anything else. It's the poor who suffer. But I was going to ask whether you'd read The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy. And that's about death, and it's about two views of death and aging. And Ivan Ilyich is a lawyer who doesn't want to die, and his family's going to the opera, and he's suffering and screaming. And he's looked after by Gerasim, who's a peasant, who sees death as a natural thing, aging and death. And he's not saying, what's your problem, Ivan? But he's saying, he holds his hand and he guides him into death. I was also thinking in the role of work, how work can be such an inspiring thing, such a vital part of our lives, that Charles will go on designing landscapes till you die. Obviously, I'm going to go on scribbling until I drop. But for many people, the end of work is also the end of their life, and they kind of check out then.
That's true, although that also goes back to what Salil's just said. I mean, for all of us privileged people doing jobs that we love, work is life. And I have a whole chapter on work because it is very clear that we need people to work longer. Working longer is generally better for us, even in jobs that we don't like. I mean, there's a lot of science backing that up. But to take your point about Tolstoy, one of the great things about art, but also something I was trying in my own smaller way to do in this book, is that it can help you to deal with the metaphysics, to actually live more intensely, because you become aware of the possibility of death rather than blanking it out.
We all age at different stages. This programme ages very, very fast, about 44 minutes, which is where we've come to, so we're out of time. Thank you to all my guests. Charles Jencks' The Universe and the Landscape, Landforms, is out now. A beautiful book it is. And there's an exhibition of his work at Jupiter Artland just outside Edinburgh. Paul Theroux's The Tao of Travel, and Catherine Mayer's Immortality, The Pleasures and Perils of Living Agelessly, are published this month, and you can see Salil Shetty in the documentary Amnesty, When They Are All Free, looking back at 50 years of Amnesty International, tomorrow night at 9 on BBC 4. Next week we'll be discussing Faith and its Followers with Jane Shaw, Ziauddin Sadar and Jonathan Kent. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Adventures of the mind today, from the way we think about ageing to campaigns for liberty, life on the road and art on the grandest scale you can imagine. Paul Theroux, one of the world's best-loved travel writers, has produced a kind of anthology or chapbook of travel writing called The Tao of Travel. 50 years after the birth of Amnesty International, its new 50-year-old General Secretary, Salil Shetty, is with us to celebrate and reminisce. Later, Catherine Mayer of Time magazine explains her new view about how we age, or try not to age, what she calls immortality. But we're starting today with one of the most ambitious and I think radical artists of our time, a man who works not in paint, bronze or even video, but in earth and clay, making what Charles Jencks calls landforms. Charles Jencks, I'm trying to find a way of visualising for people the work that you do, and perhaps one way of doing that would be to talk about the work that's being created right at the moment in Northumberland. So perhaps you could just start by describing that.
Well, a lot of my work comes from coal sites. Cleaning up the environment became the metaphor for chaos, and that was 2003 and 4, just at the time Iraq was being attacked with this pseudo-war on terror.
I could think of other examples of gardening about war. One of the most famous Scottish artists would be Ian Hamilton Finlay, who created a great garden. And he said something that you quoted in your book about gardens not being a retreat, but a form of attack.
He said, famously, a garden is not just a retreat from the world, but an attack. And his work was meant and was critical of the contemporary democratic situation, its democratic deficit, and some of the problems of the hypocrisy of political correctness. So he was a key figure.
Before we open this up, just let me ask a little bit about the economics of the art you do, because a great deal of modern art is about producing an easily saleable, instantly recognisable image or series of images for an artist. So whether it's Damien Hirst or whoever it is will produce something that is instantly and recognisably a Damien Hirst, which has a high...
largest human figure on this planet. I think, of course it's very hard to prove, but the next biggest is being constructed in stone, I think in Wyoming, near the presidents, the 4 presidents who were sculpted. That's 50 feet high, and her face, Northumberlandia's face, is 150 feet long.
Wow.
So it makes, parts of her body so big that you don't recognize where you are on her. You recognize her nose. If you fell off her nose, it would be really dangerous, 20-foot drop. And that's one of the interesting problems, to map the human body, the face, to the landscape. And I didn't want anything that was too recognizable all the time. I mean, what could be more boring than being confronted by the Colossus of Tony Blair? It would drive you crazy. So I have to design something that comes in and out of focus.
That's wonderful. And some of your other works, the sort of serpentine, terraced, sculpted, cut, carved landscapes with clear shapes in them which refer to, a lot of the time in recent years, scientific ideas.
Yes, absolutely. Well, disturbance, and in this case, it's about a quarter of a mile long landform, which I was asked to design by Matt Ridley and Banks, a coal company, and they wanted something that would be a gateway to the north. So I was explicitly asked to do an icon. And I thought for a long time, well, what is worthy of, what's on our mind most of the time? Not necessarily sex, but the body, the face, and our interaction with people. We have more neurons to do with facial recognition than you can believe than any other point of recognition. And so I worked very hard designing a landform in the shape of a reclining woman, twisted in a kind of serpentina, a dancing figure. After I'd done it, I realized that such a figure was drawn in the caves of Lascaux, the same sort of zigzag figure, showing how old that image is, really, and how iconic. We immediately...
This woman will be vast. I mean, she will be the size of some of those great cut horses in the south of England, or even longer.
She'll be even much bigger. I think she's by 3 times the big idea, of course, with the decline of religion and meta-narratives explaining what's going on to us, I think the universe or the cosmos has taken over that role. And so I work with scientists, although I criticize some of their metaphors, like the Big Bang. It wasn't big, wasn't a bang, no one heard it. It was a fast expansion of space. I use these metaphors, black hole, another one, and I criticize them and then design visual metaphors of value, as Gombrich used to say. Something that is striking, original, and related to our bodies, once again.
You are trying to make art quite seriously about the most profound and often most difficult ideas that we're struggling with now. This is art which sometimes may look like a garden, but is cerebral.
Well, during the invasion of Iraq, I was asked to design a garden in France for around the notion of chaos, and so I naturally took war as one of the most chaotic institutions of the human, and had created a water pult where water is thrown back and forth, and used it to signify the Israeli-Palestinian tit for tat. So a water war garden